Happy to have you all here. We have a fantastic panel of individuals. I'm very excited to hear from all of them who are, in many ways, I think they're pioneers in some of the areas that we're going to be talking about. One of the things when I was trying to think about the theme of this session is not so much a particular topic area or a particular element of this, but what are some of the pressing issues? What are the things that we need to be thinking about related to this topic of masculinities and peace and violence? And how can we move forward in really key ways around this? And so, I think the people that we have here really demonstrate the value of combining scholarship and practice in the field and the ways that each of these can drive each other to advance and be innovative and really move in new, exciting ways around this. So in addition to sharing their experience and perspectives, I'm hoping they'll ask us some provocative questions about what we need to be doing and how we do it. One of the things that came up in the last session and has come up a few times now is, it's not just about engaging men and addressing masculinity, but it's about doing that in the right way and doing that in a way that is really going to accomplish our goals rather than just doing that because it's the flavor of the month. So I also want to encourage you, we're going to definitely be leaving enough time for questions, so be thinking about the good questions and the intersectionalities that you want to address when we get to that. And one other thing I guess that I just want to throw out there that I wanted to make sure that we address in this panel discussion is the concept of men's multiple identities in conflict and post-conflict settings. So not just men as perpetrators of violence, but also men as victims and witnesses of violence, and then men as agents of change for nonviolence, for sustainable peace building, for gender equality, and for healing from conflict and violence. So without further ado, let me do just a quick introduction of our panelists in the order that they'll be speaking. First, on my left here is Anthony Cawdy. Anthony's a psychologist and project coordinator with Abad, the Resource Center for Gender Equality in Beirut, Lebanon. So he's been working there for the past 6 years. We're piloting a lot of new, exciting projects related to engaging men to prevent violence against women in Lebanon. He's contributed to create local forums of men standing to end gender-based violence in rural areas, overseen the first ever White Ribbon campaign in the Middle East North Africa region, and written several workbooks for facilitating discussions on gender equality with adolescents, with adult men, and also doing some really interesting work around establishing the first psychological rehabilitation clinic for men with abusive behaviors in the Middle East North Africa region. So our second speaker will be Isabel Huskins from Women Peacemakers program. Isabel's the executive director of the program. She's been with the program since 2002 when it was part of IFOR, a program that focused on women's empowerment for peace by providing capacity building for women peace activists worldwide, documenting women's activism for peace, and advocating for the inclusion of a gender perspective in peace building. And I think Isabel's organization and herself in particular have really been pioneers kind of driving this concept of how we engage men equitably and the right way in peace building and in violence prevention. So under her leadership in 2009, Women's Peacemakers program started pioneering this program on including a masculinities perspective in gender-sensitive peace building. And then WPP was established as an independent foundation in 2012, and since then she's been the executive director. She's also worked in a number of different other post-conflict settings and is a board member for the Post-2015 Women's Coalition and serves on the advisory committee for the 16 Days campaign. So, third speaker will be Kate Buchanan. Kate's managing partner at the Athena Consortium, which provides advice on a range of matters in peace processes, and she will be wearing kind of two hats today. She's also the director of the Surviving Gun Violence Project, an initiative focused on gun-related disability, trauma, and impairment. She's got a brand new book out. She was the chief editor and contributing author for the collection Gun Violence, Disability, and Recovery, and I believe there are photos that are connected with the Surviving Gun Violence Project in that book in the photo exhibit just outside to our right here. So I encourage you all to go check that out. She's previously worked for the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. She's a gender equality specialist in the Australian Civilian Corps, and she was first appointed to establish the ARMS program in the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue Then as a senior advisor on incorporating gender into the operational and policy work of the organization. She's also worked with UNDP, Viva Rio, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, International Action Network on Small Arms, all of these great organizations. So very happy to have you here as well. She'll be followed by Onan David. Onan is the program manager for gender and sexuality at the Refugee Law Program in Kampala, Uganda, doing a lot of really exciting work. Onan's a psychologist, and he works with refugees and other forced migrants on conflict-related sexual violence from across the Great Lakes region of Africa. He's been involved in key research projects on working with men and boys survivors of sexual violence in conflict and displacement, most recently the assessment screening to identify survivors of GBV toolkit, which has successfully enabled screening of more than 2,600 refugees throughout Uganda. He also works intensively on issues around sexuality and persecution on grounds of sexual orientation and gender identity. And then wrapping us up today will be Robert Egnell. Robert's a visiting professor and director of teaching at Georgetown University Center for Security Studies, as well as a senior faculty advisor to the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. He has previously been an associate professor at the Swedish National Defense College, senior researcher at the Swedish Defense Research Agency, and lecturer at the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. And his current research focuses on human security and the protection of civilians in conflict and post-conflict societies, as well as gender in military organizations and operations. More generally, his research is focused on different aspects of the conduct and effectiveness of international peace operations and post-conflict peace building. And his most recent book is Gender, Military Effectiveness, and Organizational Change, the Swedish Model. So, I'm going to let them get all into this and take us in some new directions. We're just going to have the panelists just kind of go through, speak one at a time, and then we'll open the discussion up to questions. So, without further ado, Anthony?
Hello. I want to start off speaking today about somewhere in northern Lebanon, in a village close to Akkar in northern Lebanon. There are young boys playing a game called Daesh. Daesh is the name in Arabic of the organization that's known in the West as ISIS. This game, from what we could gather in one of the trainings that we did, talking about the type of games that we play and the socialization of young men, from what we could gather, the game consisted of young men on a street or in an area running around, shooting each other, trying to win over the other groups. One group would be the regime, another group would be the resistance, one group would be Daesh. And that's the game that's being played by some men in a village in northern Lebanon, close to the border of Syria, in a very high conflict area. When you talk to people from the region, in the area, the locals, they say that this is disturbing, but at the end of the day, this is just boys being boys. This is just the way that men play. This is the way that boys play. This is very typical. And if we think about, when I think about my life, I shouldn't assume things of the audience, but I can definitely relate, even though I wasn't born in that context. But our job here at the symposium and outside of the symposium is not to just look at it that shallow. We're supposed to look at the implications. So let's zoom in for a moment and look at what those implications mean for those boys and the type of men that they become and the type of patriarchal societies that spurn from those actions. First of all, this is how these young men learn to resolve conflict. That when someone disagrees with you, you shoot at them. When two people have a different opinion, whether that be based on spirituality and religion, or political stance, or societal norms, or whatever that conflict might be, the way to resolve that conflict is through violence. He who is right is the one that writes the history, is the one that decides how the society will be. That's what the message that these men walk away from. That's how you win the game. When you're on the street, the ones that go home and brag about beating the other ones are the one that killed the other team. They're the ones who killed most of their friends. They're the ones who shot better. They're the ones who dodged the bullets better. And that doesn't go away. That is exactly how they see that conflict is resolved in their societies. We also learn that power, dominance, and violence are the most important things that you can develop in life as a young boy. Because if you were smart or you were intelligent to the extent that you can use that in strategy to win a war, perhaps that's something that's good. But being vulnerable or being caring, feeling for the other person, having high levels of empathy, those aren't things that win in the game. And those aren't things that win later on in life as a man growing up in that context. Being able to negotiate, these are not things that you learn to value when you're a young man growing up in a conflict area. You learn power, you learn dominance, you learn violence, and that is reinforced every single day, even as a child playing a game. If we want to look to another level, what happens to the boys who don't play along? What happens to the boys who just don't feel like they want to play in such a violent game or are not necessarily good at being violent or dominant? Those young men are made fun of. Those young men are emasculated. Those young men are psychologically, if not physically, sometimes tortured by the rest of the young men in the group. And they have a choice on their hands. They can either reform to the traditional gender stereotype and learn to be violent, or learn how to obey the violent ones and do whatever they say. And that way they can be part of the in crowd and probably save themselves from a little bit of outcasting themselves in that small social group. Or they can choose to live outside of that box and deal every day with being outcasted, deal every day with being made fun of, dealing every day with probably being a victim of violence. Even for young boys who might not see it as that, that's exactly what they're doing. Let's take it to another level. Where are the girls? Where do the girls fall in this game? And the answer is they don't. They are not allowed to play. They are on the sidelines. They are playing with baby dolls or playing house or at home doing some of the chores while the boys are outside playing. And if a girl is brave enough to say, no, I want to play with you, if we want to call that brave, they either don't allow her to play or they allow her to play, and everyone is focused specifically on her so that they can teach that girl, if you want to play boys' games, you're not strong enough to play at the games that boys play. Again, zooming out for a moment, we can see that the men who don't play along with violence don't really have a say later on in life in how conflicts are resolved in conflict and post-conflict areas. And women are completely non-existent from that process. Again, that's something that begins on the street, playing a game on a everyday afternoon in this village. So if we want to look at another level, which this one we look at very typically, but I think it merits being mentioned every time we talk about the socialization of young men, is the normalization of this violence. We're talking about some young men who are more comfortable holding a gun or a gun-like object than they are holding a pencil and writing, or holding a book and reading. Before they could hold a pencil and write their names, they were given toy guns. They thought it was fun, and it was fun to shoot at objects, to shoot at loved ones, and have the loved ones pretend they're dying. This was just part of growing up. These men do not know what they're doing. These boys do not know what they're doing. They are simply playing. And they're playing with guns, and they're being prepared. So when they grow up and someone hands them a gun, that doesn't feel foreign to them. When they grow up and someone says, point at that person and shoot, that doesn't feel foreign to them. And this is actually, all of this is nothing that is solely in the Lebanese context. We can find it in every single culture that we look at, to different degrees and different contexts. Might not be called the Daesh where you come from, but there is a game, and it might even have a specific context for that society or for that conflict that's in that region. So these young men are feeling very comfortable with that. Even looking at, I don't want to get into this right now, but the video game consoles and the type of games that we see young men playing every day, they're not imagining themselves in Iraq. They're in Iraq, shooting at whoever the opposition is. This is all very normal to them before they hit puberty. So later on, are we surprised that men so willingly go to war without thinking about the consequences? One of the last things I'd like to say is that it's more than just a normalization of violence. It's more than just having men feel comfortable holding that gun. It's a glorification of that violence. Yesterday I was thinking to myself, the name of this is Men and Boys for Gender Justice. And I thought about the word justice. And the first thing that popped in my head was the Justice League, which was Superman and Batman and Aquaman and all of these other things. But even them, not thinking that these characters were created with violence in mind, but they were men that sought justice and fought for right through violence. Violence was a justification of whatever they needed to do in order to fight for what is good and right. And what is good and right? That's perspective. And when we fail to negotiate, when we fail to talk, when we assume that who will win the war will be the strongest, it really doesn't matter what we're arguing about anymore. It really doesn't matter what perspective of right or wrong you have. All that matters is if you're stronger than the other person, if you're more violent and more dominant than the other person. And I started thinking about all the other words that were monopolized by violence, that have connotations through war of great things. There's justice, respect, responsibility, honor, liberty. Even the word peace has been something that has been used in diction in order to justify war and violence for all of our societies. We're doing this war for peace. We are fighting this war for peace. We are dropping these bombs for peace. So when we want to think about the centrality of violence in the hegemonic masculine gender role and the one that is still prevalent all around the world today, we really need to look at how these men are being socialized, how these women are being socialized, and the implications for later on. Because when I look at that and I think about where we stand when it comes to 1325, which I know some of my colleagues will speak more about in detail, it's not really surprising that the state of states in conflict and post-conflict are the way they are. It's not a surprise that that process is still overly violent and focused on violence, and it's no surprise that women are not in the process, because boys are just playing a game. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. I'm going to try to connect to what you were saying. My name is Isabel Huskins. I'm working for the Women Peacemakers program. As Joe said, we started in '97 as a women's program within an international peace movement. And the peace movement is about 100 years old, really connecting the members around active nonviolence as a core principle, but also a strategy to work for peace. In the mid-90s, the women in IFOR really started voicing the need for women's leadership also within this peace movement. Because what I would like to share today is, because we have peace movements or nonviolent movements, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be about gender equality or that women's leadership is a natural given. So in '97, that led to the creation of our program, which very much focused on creating an environment where women could come together and share their experiences about how they were building peace on the ground, creating training of trainers, building women's skills on nonviolent mobilizing, conflict mediation, but also awareness on how do you create gender awareness within your own organizations, in your own peace movement. We were very much supported in 2000 when the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 1325, which was really the international community recognizing not only the enormous impact that war has on women's lives and the specific gendered impact that war has on women's lives, but also the key role that women have to play as leaders in conflict resolution, in peace building, and also the rebuilding of their societies. Now, for many years we were really focusing, there were three aspects of our work, which was really the capacity building with women activists on the ground, documenting women's stories, what are they doing for peace, because as we all know in history, a lot of what women do is not recorded, so then, you know, there are no role models and there's no records of that women actually have done something. And a lot of our work was also creating awareness on 1325 within the peace organizations, peace movements, saying this is really your issue. This is not a private matter. This is at the heart of building peace in our societies. In 2008, we brought the women together, a global group, to really analyze where are we now. We have 8 years of 1325. We have almost more than 10 years of doing our work. What's going well and where are the challenges? And the women were talking about a lot of empowerment and doing great peace work on the ground. The main obstacle that they were facing is that society in general has no gender analysis of violence. And second, the men were really not on board of this 1325 agenda. That was for them a women's movement issue. It was not something which is at the heart of building sustainable peace and security. So then also as Women Peacemakers program, we had to look at ourselves. And many of the women had been saying for years, this program is great, but we should have men here during these trainings. And we were like, no, we're really about women's leadership, and we need to have safe spaces for women. But we really started to hear the call for, men are part of changing the power game. And then we really looked at women, peace and security as an important tool in this. The 1325 agenda is about gender, peace and security. So we really took it upon us to introduce the masculinities perspective into the work, which is really about connecting the dots and clarifying how the male gender identity is actually being affected and also being used during times of war. We started a pilot program where we brought activists together, male activists from different parts of the world. So the first part really was about going through this journey where we really made the link between patriarchy and militarization of men's lives. Research has shown that there's a correlation between gender equality in society and the levels of violence that exist. So the more patriarchal a society is, the more the focus is on what Anthony was sharing on power over dominance, control of other men and other people in the society. And there's really a militarization of society. There's a lot of privilege that comes with that for men. But what is really important to highlight is also the cost. If you want to get men to get involved as allies, it's to also point out the costs. The cost is dehumanization of men's lives. Men are being taught to kill others, to put their own lives at risks. And also, not only during war itself, but also in the after effect. Working in Bosnia and Northern Ireland, there were a lot of domestic violence cases, alcohol abuse, depression amongst men, suicide. So those are the costs that come during the post-conflict phase. So it's really creating this awareness on what does gender and peace building and what does gender lens on war mean. So by engaging men, not through a very abstract concept of women, peace and security, this is the resolution, but really through their own lived experiences, they could start connecting the dots and seeing that gender is about power. They could see the role of gender equality and women's rights. So it really created the support and the men starting to work as allies with women. in our network. The second one is, as Anthony is saying, okay, if you are working on challenging hegemonic masculinities and challenging militarized masculinities, you also need to provide an alternative, because there's always going to be social injustice and there's going to be conflict. And for that, really, our nonviolence roots were the answer. In nonviolence theory and principles, conflict in itself is not seen necessarily as something negative. Conflict is a tension, and it can create actually something good. It's about how do you manage that conflict. Now, in our cultures, we really learn to deal with conflict in a way of many times using violence, or it's a lose-win situation. It's about overpowering, where nonviolence really operates on a different power concept. It's the power concept of power with. And nonviolence is about strategizing, it's about skill. So it's not only believing in the dignity and the human rights of other people, it's actually learning tools. How do you make sure that if there's an injustice in your society, you know how to mobilize? And there are 198 tools that communities all over the world have developed. So there's a huge body of knowledge and skills that's out there, and we are not learning that in our daily lives, not in our schools, nor when we go to university. So a lot of what we do is about really teaching and training people on nonviolent mobilization. And I would like to say here that there's increasing also research in this area showing that nonviolent strategies are far more effective to achieve your policy goals. Stefan and Chenoweth have researched nonviolent actions and movements between 1900 and 2006 and found out that in achieving their policy goals, they're 53% of the time they're successful, whereas violent strategies and campaign only have a success rate of 26%. So we need these data to really show that this is working. Some lessons learned for us: there are no shortcuts when you do this kind of work. When you engage with men and with women, it's really about paradigm shifts on the level of gender, on the level of power, on the level of how we see peace. So it's long-term engagement. It's not only talking about political work and political awareness, it's about inner transformation. Nor is it only talking about inner transformation, it's also about making the personal political. So you really need to go through that long-term journey together. For us, it's very much about men and women as partners. When we did our project, we are accountable to the women's peace movement, to women's rights movements. So in every level, women are part of designing the program. They're resource people together with the men. So we really show partnership on every level. Women have been there as mentors for the men that are doing the work in the field. And women have been part of evaluating the impact of our work. It's important to always keep the whole picture in front of you. So I think the message should not be that men are victims. We need to focus on men being victims of war, but we need to make sure that is not going to be the only message. There is also privilege, there's responsibility, and there's women's leadership that needs to get its space. So it also means men making space and giving up some of the privilege and the power. And that is very hard, specifically during times of conflict. Very much so, I would like to highlight the feminist thinking, the feminist anti-war movements that have been around for decades, that have had brilliant analysis on war and peace. And it's very important for us to take those lessons learned on board. And last but not least, there's some more that I want to talk about, the global study that's coming up next year, or the high-level review on 1325 that's coming up next year. But very important is, nonviolent movements, again, are not necessarily gender sensitive. So I just like to take the box that we got, which I think is really a brilliant initiative, this gift, because it really shows that there are men that have shown that you can address conflict in a different way than using violence. And this is very important, and we need more of that. But coming from the nonviolence movement, we had to generate awareness that there's a problem if in nonviolent movements we only have male role models. And when we do our exercises, most people can name male Nobel Peace Prize winners, but the women that have led movements for peace are often not known. And these are the role models for the girls, but also for the boys out there. So we've kind of put another picture on the other side of the coaster, because this is really, if we do this work, it's really about creating change also, by allowing space for women's leadership. last but not least, just very quickly, I would like to focus on the high-level review. Right now, we're going into our 15th year of 1325. The Secretary General has commissioned a global study, which is taking place right now, to see where are we in terms of 1325 implementation and how to take it forward. There's still a very long road to go. We had a panel in New York 2 weeks ago with activists from the MENA region, the Middle East North Africa region. There is a lot to celebrate. Women have been crucial during the Arab Spring. They have been on the streets in massive numbers. Women have been very active in difficult transition periods, trying to get women's rights into constitutions. They're working on national action plans. Iraq is the first country in the region with the national action plan. Women's movements from all over the world have been reaching out in solidarity to women on the ground to make sure that their local voices are also reaching the UN. That has been working, and 1325 has been a good tool for that. Challenge has been many. Peace negotiations, women in the region have hardly been able to have a voice there. Sexual violence as a weapon of war is being used on a massive scale, despite the fact that we have Resolution 1820 in follow-up of 1325, which really addresses this. We see a lot of women saying that 1325 work on the ground is very much on an ad hoc activity base. It's not really, they're not getting the long-term support that they need. And again, we're talking about paradigm change, changing gender lenses in societies that are not open to this, trying to address the way we look at peace. So this is long-term, very tough work that needs long-term support. Women also have been talking about the difficulty, and this is really where I would like to start to round up, about militarism and militarization in the region, and we would like to say militarization in the whole world, basically, where you see the proliferation of weapons, the turning, the state agents and non-state agents using excessive violence against civil society and civil society activists in specifically. And this came up also during the Security Council debates in New York. All the states make statements about how they see the 1325 implementation every year. And it was actually only the civil society speaker. She's from Iraq. She's a human rights activist, Suad Alami, the only one who was speaking on behalf of civil society, who said, at the core of 1325 is investing in conflict prevention, demilitarization, disarmament. And this is exactly what we as gender peace movement, as WPP, were a bit concerned about, that over the years, 1325 seems to have, for a large part, become about adding women to existing peace and security paradigms and existing structures. So there's been a lot of discussion on getting women into the military, into security forces, and I'm not saying that we don't need to look at that. But when we look at the Beijing Platform for Action, which was really the mother of 1325, it was about women redefining peace and security. It was really about conflict prevention, about addressing arms proliferation and making sure investments are into social investments, into strong societies. And we kind of feel that this has been marginalized over the years, also within the women, peace and security sector. So even their hegemony is at play. And we would almost say that the conflict prevention, nonviolence is as kind of the woman within the peace and security sector. It's the soft, seen as a bit less professional, under-resourced. It's admired for its beauty from afar, but it's not really part of the hardcore business. So for us, 1325, but also a masculinities lens really helps because it brings in the larger gender dimension of war and peace. It's really about redefining what peace and security is about. So it's about men and women working in partnership, but really challenging hegemony on many, many levels. So, thank you.